Extinction. It is a process as old and as natural as creation itself. Jungles become wastelands, seas become deserts, and mountains crumble to dust. The living force maintains a balance that cannot be defied. For every action, there is reaction, and for every decision, there is consequence. And light cannot exist without darkness. Just as the Force provides more strong beings in the aftermath of war, so too does it allow the light or the dark to ascend when the other has ruled for too long. When this metamorphosis occurs, events of such gravity unfold that they are forever etched into the fabric of galactic history. And every being for which the Force speaks through bears witness to an irrevocable shift. A shift that can be as beautiful as the rising of Tatooine's twin suns, or as terrifying as the Jedi Temple engulfed in flames. This is the story of deception. This is the story of the sacking of Coruscant. Malgus let his anger build with every step he took towards the temple's entrance. The Force responded to his emotional state, caught him up in its power until he was awash in it. He sensed the seed of fear growing in the soldier's guts. "I said stop," the lead soldier said again. "Do nothing," Malgus said to Alena over his shoulder. "These are mine." She let her hands fall slack to her sides and fell in behind him. The three guards spread out into an arc as they approached him, their movements cautious, blaster rifles ready. The entrance to the temple, a 15-meter-tall opening in the edifice's facade, looming behind them. "Who are you?" the guard asked. The last word hung in the air, frozen in time, as Malgus drew on the Force and augmented his speed. The hilt of his lightsaber filled his hand, and its red line split the air. He cross-cut the guard before him, putting a black canyon in his chest, continued the swing through the guard on his left, and with his left hand, used a blast of power to drive the third guard into the temple wall, hard enough to crush bones and kill him. Malgus felt a sudden surge of terror in the two guards up on the ledge to his left, felt them take aim with sweaty hands, starting to squeeze triggers. He flung his lightsaber at them, guided it with the Force in a flickering red arc that cut both of them down, then recalled the blade to his hand. He deactivated it and hung it from his belt. The roar of a rocket pack drew his attention. On the ledge above the temple's entrance, the Mandalorian rode the fire on her back to a high window on the temple's upper tiers and disappeared within. He trusted she would join him in the combat inside. He checked his chrono, watched the numbers evaporate. 29 seconds. Alena took station to his right as they entered the temple. The setting sun at their back reached through the huge doorway and extended their shadows before them. Giant, dark heralds marking the path ahead. Within the temple was a stillness, a peace soon to be shattered. Malgus's boots rapped against the polished stone floor. The hall extended before them for several hundred meters. 2 rows of elegant columns reached the floor to ceiling on either side, framing a processional down the hall's center. Malgus felt the presence of more guards and Jedi to his right, his left, and before him. He checked his chrono. 12 seconds. Motion above and to his right, then to his left drew his eyes. Curious Padawans looked from the ledges above. Ahead, half a dozen robed and hooded Jedi dropped from the balconies and took station in the hall. Another Jedi descended the grand staircase at the end of the hall. His Force signature radiated power, confidence, a master. As one, the 7 Jedi moved towards Malgus and Alena, and Malgus and Alena moved towards them. More and more Padawans gathered on the balconies and hallways above. Sparks of light-side blasphemy flickering in Malgus's perception. The more powerful force signatures of the approaching Jedi pressed against Malgus, and his against theirs. The power of each distorting the other by its presence. In his mind, the countdown continued. The space between them and the Jedi diminished. The power within him grew. They stopped at 2 meters. The Jedi Master threw back his hood to reveal blonde hair graying at the temples, a handsome, rubbery face. Malgus knew his name from the intelligence briefings, Master Ven Zalo. In appearance, Zalo was everything Malgus, with his pale skin, scars, and hairless pate, was not. With respect to the Force, Malgus was everything Zalo was not. The 6 Jedi Knights accompanying Zalo spaced themselves around Malgus and Alena to minimize maneuvering room. The Jedi eyed him cautiously, the way they might a trapped predator. Alena put her back to Malgus's. Malgus felt her breathing, deep and regular. Somewhere, a Padawan cleared his throat. Another coughed. Malgus and Zalo stared into each other's eyes, but exchanged no words. None were necessary. Both knew what would unfold next, what must unfold. The chrono on Malgus's wrist beeped. The light sound rang out like an explosion in the silent vastness of the hall. The sound seemed to free the Jedi to act. Half a dozen green and blue lines pierced the dimness as all the Jedi Knights ignited their lightsabers, backed off a step, and assumed a fighting stance. All except Zalo, who held his ground before Malgus. Malgus credited him for it and inclined his head in a show of respect. Perhaps the Jedi Knights thought the beeping chrono indicated a bomb of some kind. In a way, Malgus supposed, it did. From behind, another sound broke the silence, the whine of a hijacked dropship's approaching engines. Malgus did not turn. Instead, he watched the events behind him by watching the events before him. The Jedi Knights stepped back another step, looking past Malgus, uncertainty in their expressions. Alena pressed herself against Malgus. No doubt she could see the dropship by now, as it roared downward toward the temple. Zalo did not step back, and his eyes stayed on Malgus. The sound of the dropship's engines grew louder, more acute, a prolonged mechanical scream. Malgus watched the eyes of the Jedi Knights widen, heard the shouts of alarm through the hall, then the screams. All of them soon overwhelmed by the roar of the reinforced dropship slamming at speed into the front of the temple. Stone shattered, and the temple's floor vibrated under the impact. Metal bent, twisted, and shrieked. People, too, bent, twisted, and shrieked. The explosion colored the hall in orange. Malgus could see it reflected in Zalo's eyes, and the sudden flame drew the oxygen toward in a powerful wind, as if the conflagration were a great pair of lungs drawing breath. Malgus did not turn. He had seen the attack thousands of times on computer modules and knew what was happening from the sounds he heard. The dropship's enormous speed and mass allowed it to retain momentum as it skittered across the temple floor, gouging stone, trailing fire, toppling columns, collapsing balconies, crushing bodies. Still, Malgus did not move, nor Zalo. The dropship skipped closer, closer, the sound of metal grinding over stone ever louder in Malgus's ears. More columns collapsed. Alena pressed against him as the flaming, shredded vessel slid towards them. It was already losing speed and soon came to a halt. Dust, heat, and smoke filled the hall. Flames crackled. Shouts of pain and surprise penetrated the sudden silence. "What have they done?" someone called. "Medic!" screamed someone else. Malgus heard the explosive bolts of the specially reinforced passenger compartment of the dropship blow outward and hit the floor like metal rain. Heard the hatch clang to the floor. For the first time, Zalo looked past Malgus, his head cocked in question. Uncertainty entered his expression. Malgus savored it. A prolonged, irregular hum sounded as the 50 Sith warriors within the dropship's compartment activated their lightsabers. The sound heralded the fall of the temple, the fall of Coruscant, the fall of the Republic. Malgus flashed on the vision he'd seen on Korriban, of a galaxy in flames. He threw back his hood, smiled, and activated his lightsaber. Master Zalo and the 6 Jedi Knights near Malgus leapt back and up, flipping at the top of the arc on their leaps, and landed in a crouch 20 meters away. "May the Force be with us all!" Dozens more Jedi poured out of the hallway behind him and flowed down the staircase, the blades of their lightsabers visible through the smoke and dust, a forest of green and blue oriental flames. The Jedi did not shout as they charged, but the rumble of their boots and sandals on the floor sounded like rolling thunder. "Stay near me," Malgus said over his shoulder to Alena. "Yes," she said, her blasters already in hand. Malgus's Sith charged out of the carcass of the dropship, their collective roar the sound of hunger. The red lines of their blades cut the dust-covered air. Lord Adras, a political favorite of Darth Angral and constant irritant to Malgus, led them. Like all of the Sith warriors, save Malgus, a dark mask obscured his face entirely. Malgus used his distaste for Adras to feed his anger. He had requested that Darth Angral allow him to lead the attack alone, but Angral had insisted that Adras lead the dropship team. Discarding his cloak, discarding the remnants of restraints on his anger, Malgus joined the Sith charge, taking position before Adras. Emotion fed his power, and its swell fairly lifted him from his feet. He felt the power of the dark side around him, within him. Blaster bolts crisscrossed the battlefield from left to right as 2 platoons of Republic soldiers emerged from somewhere above into the side field of the Sith ranks. Malgus, nestled deeply in the Force, perceived the dozens of bolts and their trajectory with perfect clarity. Without breaking stride, he whipped his blade left, right, and angled at 10 degrees, and turned 3 bolts back on the soldiers who'd fired them, killing all of them. A soldier had exploded a grenade in his face in the Battle of Alderaan, so he enjoyed killing soldiers when he could. Behind him, Alena's twin blasters answered to the left and right with bolts of their own, picking off 2 more soldiers. The Sith and Jedi forces closed, Sith battlelust facing the calm of the Jedi, the floor of the temple, the arena where centuries of indeterminate strife would at last reach a conclusion. Those strong in the Force would survive, and their understanding of the Force would evolve. Those weak in the Force would die. Malgus sought Master Zalo, but could not make him out from the crowd of faces, dust, flames, and glowing blades. So he chose a Jedi at random from the crowd, a human male with a blue blade and a short beard, and targeted him Waves of power distorted the air and Dopplered sound as the Jedi and Sith forces crashed into one another and intermixed in a chaotic roaring of tangled bodies, lightsabers, and shouts. Malgus augmented his strength with the Force, took a two-handed grip on his blade, and unleashed a fury of overhand slashes designed to split the Jedi in half. The Jedi sidestepped the blow and cross-cut with his blue blade at Malgus' throat. Malgus got his blade up in time, parried, and slammed a kick into the Jedi's midsection. The blow folded the Jedi in half, sent him reeling backward 5 paces. Malgus leapt into the air, flipped, landed behind him, and drove his blade through the Jedi. Roaring with battle lust, Malgus sought another opponent. A flash of lavender skin drew his gaze. Alena. She ducked under a saber slash and dived to her side, firing half a dozen blaster bolts as she did so. The Padawan who tried to kill her, a female Zabrak, the horns of her head gilt with colorless pigments, deflected the shots as she closed in for another blow. Alena flipped to her feet, still firing, but the Padawan deflected every shot and drew nearer. Malgus drew on the Force, and with a blast of power, drove the Padawan across the hall and into the towering columns of stone, where she collapsed, blood leaking from her nose. Alena continued firing, her eyes darting here and there over the battlefield as she sought targets. The battle turned more chaotic. Jedi and Sith leapt, bounced, rolled, and flipped as red lines intersected with those of blue and green. Blasts of power sent bodies flying through the air, against walls, pulled loose rocks from the ceiling and sent them crashing into flesh. The hall was a cacophony of sound, shouts, screams, the hum of lightsabers, the intermittent sound of weapons fire. Malgus walked in its midst, reveled in it. He watched Lord Adras leap into the middle of a squad of Republic soldiers and punctuated his landing with an explosion of Force energy that cast the soldiers away like dry leaves. Malgus, not to be outdone, picked a Jedi Knight at random, a human female 10 meters away, and held forth his left hand, and discharged veins of blue lightning from his fingertips. The jagged lines of energy cut a swath through the battle, harvesting 2 Padawans as they went, until they caught the Jedi Knight and lifted her off her feet. She screamed as the lightning ripped into her, her flesh made temporarily translucent from the dark power coursing through her. Malgus savored her pain as she died. He caught Adras eyeing him and gave a mocking salute with his lightsaber. The high-pitched sound of Alena's blasters drew his attention. She bounded past him and over the slain female Jedi Knight's corpse, a lavender blur firing rapidly. Putting her back to a column, she crouched and sought targets with her blasters. She met his eyes, winked, and signaled behind him. He whirled to see a score of more Republic soldiers rushing into the hall from the side room, blaster rifles tracing hot lines through the battlefield. Alena answered with shots of her own. Before Malgus could dispatch the soldiers, the Mandalorian rose from somewhere behind them, her jetpack spitting fire, her head-to-toe silver and orange armor gleaming in the fire of the temple. Hovering in the air like an avenging spirit, she discharged 2 small missiles from her wrist mounts. They struck the temple floor near the Republic soldiers and blossomed into flame. Bodies, shouts, and loose rock fell in all directions. Still hovering, she spun a circle in the air while flamethrowers mounted on her forearm engulfed another group of soldiers. Malgus knew the battle had turned, that it soon would be over. He glanced around, still seeking Zalo, the only opponent in the field worthy of his attention. Before he could locate the Jedi Master, 3 more Jedi swarmed him. He parried the chop of the human male, leapt over the low slash of an orange-skinned Togruta female, severed the hand of the third, a human female, disarming her, then grabbed her by the throat with his free hand and slammed her into the floor with his force-enhanced strength. "Alora!" said the human male. Leaping high over the male's cross-slash, Malgus landed behind the Togruta, who parried his lightsaber strike but could not defend himself against a force blast that sent her skidding across the hall and into a pile of rubble. Malgus roared, the lust for battle so pronounced that he would have killed his own warriors if there were no Jedi left to slay. He wanted, needed to kill another, and to do so with his hands. He ducked under a slash from the male, lunged forward, and took the Jedi by the throat. He lifted him to his feet and held him suspended in the air, gagging. The Jedi's brown eyes showed no fear, but they did show pain. Malgus roared, squeezed hard, then dropped the body and stood over it, blade at his side, breath coming hard. The battle still swirled around him as he stood in its center, the eye of the Sith storm. Malgus finally spotted Master Zalo 10 paces away, whirling, spinning, his green blade a blur of precision and speed. One Sith warrior fell to him, another. Lord Adras landed before him, trying to take Malgus's kill for himself. Adras ducked low and slashed at Zalo's knees. Zalo leapt over the blow and unleashed a blast of energy that sent Adras skidding on his backside across the hall. "He is mine!" Malgus shouted, charging through the battlefield. He repeated himself as he passed Adras. "Zalo is mine!" Zalo must have heard Malgus, for he turned, met his eyes. Alena too must have heard Malgus's shouting. She emerged from behind the column, deduced Malgus's intent, and fired several shots at Zalo. Zalo, his eyes on Malgus throughout, deflected the bolts with his blade and sent them back at Alena. 2 struck her, and she collapsed. Zalo used the force to drive her body against a column. Malgus halted in mid-stride, his rage temporarily abated. He turned and stared at Alena's fallen form for a long moment. Her lavender body crumpled on the floor, her eyes closed, 2 black circles marring the smooth purple field of her flesh. She looked like a wilted flower. Anger filled him, overcame him. A shout of hate, raw and jagged, burst from his throat. Power went with it, shattering a nearby column and sending a rain of stone shards through the room. He turned his gaze to Zalo and stalked towards him, his rage and power surging before him in a palpable wave. Another Jedi stepped in front of him, blue blade held high. Malgus barely saw him. He simply extended a hand, pushed through the Jedi's insufficient defenses, and seized his throat with the Force, and choked him to death. Tossing the body aside, he moved towards Zalo. Zalo, for his part, moved towards Malgus. A Sith warrior bounded at Zalo from his left, but Zalo leapt over the Sith's blade, spun, slashed, and cut down the Sith. Zalo and Malgus closed. They halted at 1 meter, studied each other for a moment. A human male Jedi Knight separated from the whirl of battle and stabbed at Malgus. Malgus sidestepped the blue line of his blade, punched the man in the stomach, doubling him over, and raised his blade for a killing blow. Zalo bounded forward and intercepted the downstroke. Zalo and Malgus stared into each other's faces, and the rest of the battle fell away. There was only Malgus and his rage, and Zalo and his calm. Their blades sizzling in opposition, each used the Force to press the strength of the other, but neither had an obvious advantage. Malgus shouted rage into Zalo's face. Only a furrowed brow and the tight line of his mouth betrayed the tension between Zalo's otherwise tranquil expression. feeding off the anger from Alena. Malgus shoved Zalo away and unleashed an onslaught of overhand slashes and crosscuts. Zalo backed off, parrying, unable to respond with blows of his own. Malgus tried to split Zalo's head, but Zalo blocked again and again. Malgus spun into a high, force-augmented kick that hit Zalo in the chest and sent him flying backwards 10 meters. Zalo flipped and landed upright in a crouch near two of Malgus's Sith warriors. They lunged for him, and Zalo parried one blow, leapt over the other, and spun a rapid circle cutting down both Sith. Malgus, burning with hate, flung his lightsaber at Zalo. He guided its trajectory with the Force, and it spun a sizzling path through the air at Zalo's neck. But Zalo, riding the momentum of his attack on the second Sith, leapt into the air and above the blade. While Zalo was still in the air, Malgus unleashed a blast of energy that caught the Jedi unprepared and sent him crashing downward into a pile of rubble. He lay there, prone. Malgus did not hesitate. He mounted the column of his anger, shouting with rage, and leapt 20 meters into the air towards Zalo. Mid-jump, he used the Force to recall his blade to his hand, took a reverse two-handed grip, and prepared to pin Zalo to the temple floor. But Zalo rolled out of the way at the last moment, and Malgus's blade sank to the hilt in the stone of the temple's floor. Zalo leapt up and over Malgus, landed in a crouch, reactivated his lightsaber, and pelted across the floor back at Malgus. Eschewing speed and grace for power, Zalo loosed a flurry of rapid strikes, slashes, and lunges. Malgus parried one blow after another, but could not find an opening to mount his own counterattack. Lunging forward, Zalo slashed crosswise. Malgus parried, and Zalo slammed the hilt of his lightsaber into the side of Malgus's jaw. A tooth dislodged, and his respirator knocked askew. Malgus tasted blood, but he was too deep in the Force for the blow to do any real damage. He staggered backward a step, as if the blow had stunned him. Seeing an opening, Zalo leapt forward and cross-cut from Malgus's throat, as Malgus knew he would do. Malgus turned his blade vertical to parry the blow and spun out of the blade lock. Reversing his lightsaber during the spin, he rode it into a stab that pierced Zalo's abdomen and came out the other side. Zalo's expression fell. He hung there, impaled by the red line. He held Malgus's eyes, and Malgus saw the flames of the burning temple reflected in Zalo's green irises. "It's all going to burn," Malgus said. Zalo's brow furrowed, perhaps with pain, perhaps with despair. Either way, Malgus enjoyed it. He waited for the light to disappear from Zalo's eyes before jerking his blade free and allowing the body to fall to the floor.